Kyiv, the Jewish Kyiv, some history of the Ukrainian capital you may not have known.
There are many facets to Ukrainian and in particular Kyiv history, one of which is Jewish, which is a part of Ukrainian culture. For example, when talking about the city center today, we can see that Mezhigorska Street, Vladimirska Street, Bolshaya Zhytomyrska Street reflect the fact these areas used to be densely populated by the Jewish people.
What's Yehupets? What did the city look like in the past? Is there Jewish life in Kyiv today? It's the city's program. Stay tuned, it's gonna be interesting.
We are standing at 8 Zhytnitorskaya Street right now. It used to be called Zhytny Bazaar. In fact, this is really almost exactly where Zhytny Bazaar used to be. Today it is commonly known as Zhytny Market, but the roofed market is situated further down the street. But there really was a market right here. House number 8, flat number 9, used to be the home to my great-grandpa, Mordecai, also known as Mordko, and my great-grandma, Shendel Sova. This is where they lived and sold fish at the market. I think they had a small fish store, and the sign exactly read, "Fish."
Meet Igor Kulakov. He's the editor of the Jewish online periodical. The street and the houses you've just heard about, the ones you're seeing in your screens, are the part of the Kyiv district known as Podol.
I feel very comfortable standing here. I can feel the atmosphere of the side street, the way it used to be in the 30s. It's my home in a way, and Podil is my home. I've always loved Podil, and I've always loved being here. I have always felt some special affinity with it. I know there's a synagogue nearby, I know which people walked here, what language they spoke. It's my history.
These past several years, Igor has intensely studied his family's history. Buckle up, the details he discovered won't be pleasant at times. We'll share them with you soon. But for now, let's go on with looking at the Jewish facet of Kyiv.
We are now at a very curious place in Kyiv, the so-called Kontraktova Square. This name was almost blotted out from the memory of many people, but without success. Because after the perestroika times, this name was restored to this place. What is the origin of this name? It's very simple. This used to be a place of trade, where the agreements, contracts, were signed. It was a place of trade. This is where the goods were taken in and distributed.
The truth is that Jews were only allowed into Kyiv in time for the conclusion of contracts, or slightly before that. They were allowed to stay only a short time, up to several weeks. It's exactly those trading sessions at Kontraktova Square that Kyiv native Yuri Bereza is familiar with, but not only from the history textbooks.
My granddad would bring timber here in pre-war times. They would cut wood in timber allotments and bring it here to sell in the Kontraktova Square. It's part of my family. I'm a fifth-generation Kyivite. My family lives in Kyiv.
Well, while it's fairly clear to guess the purpose of Kontraktova Square from its name, the name Podol and why it became home for so many Jews is still a mystery for a lot of people.
Every spring, the Dnieper River flooded when the snow melted. The winters in Kyiv used to be different from the ones we have now. Everything was flooded with water here. And many Jewish people chose this place not because they simply loved living there, but because no one else wanted to live here. And since the Jewish people are quite blessed and hard-working people, they could make this place truly livable. Since a number of trading activities in the center of Kyiv were unavailable for the Jews, they developed this district for living and trading in.
Obviously, the Jewish history of Kyiv isn't limited to Podol only. In fact, the history of the local Jewish congregation is as ancient as Kyiv itself. Can you believe it?
The Jewish congregation of Kyiv is part of the city's history. the history of the city. A long time ago, 1,000 years ago, there was a Jewish congregation in the days of Volodymyr Monomach.
The first proof bearing record to the ancient history of the Kyiv Jewish congregation is, as generally accepted, this document, better known as the Kyiv letter. This letter was addressed to the Kyiv Jews, to foreign fellow believers, and is dated back to the first half of the 10th century. What does it mean? It means that here, already in the 10th century, the Jewish congregation was alive and well, and so it grew to be this large.
In the beginning of the 1940s, 840,000 people lived in Kyiv. 226,000 of them were Jews. In other words, 30% of Kyiv pre-war population was Jewish.
The history of the Kyiv Jews is one of the most painful of all ethnicities in this area. It's this ethnic group that was constantly deprived of their right to live in peace for centuries. Multiple decrees expelling Jews from Kyiv deserve a special notice. One day the decrees were enacted, another day they were revoked. That was going on over and over again. Very often Jews were not allowed to live in the city area. Prohibitions of this kind led to certain blind spots in history and absence of data. For example, after the prohibition of 1619, data of Jews in Kyiv disappeared for a long time. In other words, it's not exactly clear how, during that period, the local Jewish community lived and developed. However, the historians have done their calculations. By the end of the 18th century, the Jewish community of the city wasn't numerous. The situation was without change until 1791, when Kyiv was added to the Pale of Settlement, territory within the borders of Tsarist Russia. Here, Jews were legally authorized to reside. It spread to a substantial part of contemporary Ukraine. Therefore, Jews were resettled en masse, so the Jewish population here increased respectively.
When we talk about modern history, the history of the 18th, 19th and the 20th century, we could say that a Jewish face is one of the faces in town. And you should understand that in the days of Bolsheviks, in the days of Stalin's regime, Kyiv was a part of the Russian Empire. There were more than 60 synagogues and prayer houses in Kyiv. In the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the Jewish community was powerful. There were scientists, students, doctors, teachers, workers. Those were people from all walks of life, but they identified themselves as Kyivites. They lived in Kyiv.
All those people didn't just live in Kyiv, they were actively involved in its development. They changed the city for the better. Do you remember the story in the beginning of our program about flooding in Podol? Well, it was this force of nature that once inspired one Kyiv Jew for a radical step that eventually changed the lives of many.
One of the rather rich Jews who lived here in Podil was Lukian. He got sick, and being tired of the problem, he went to live a little bit higher. He built himself a mansion. An infrastructure appeared there, and poorer Jews began moving there. That place is named Lukyanovka in the name of that man.
Since we brought up an issue of the city development, Kyiv architecture is worth mentioning, as well as the fact that some unique buildings appeared in the map of Kyiv thanks to the Jews, and without them the architectural look of the city is, to put it lightly, not the same. For example, the Bessarabsky Market, the most famous market in Ukraine, as well as the Polytechnic University, were built using the funds of a famous Kyiv millionaire, a Jew, Lazarus Brodsky. Indeed, the city benefited from all those novelties at the time, and the lives of so many city people improved. Besides the usual trade and banking business, Jewish families, for instance, also developed steam shipping on the Dnipro, electric trams also, and plumbing, etc. So we can say that the Jewish community made a substantial contribution in Kyiv becoming a truly developed city of the 20th century. We can only imagine the progress Kyiv could have made during the past few centuries if the Jews hadn't been constantly oppressed and persecuted. The Jewish pogroms deserve a special notice. They, from time to time, literally ruined the life of the local community. It's the pogroms that were the reason why some brilliant and influential Jews, without exaggeration, had to flee the city.
A horrendous pogrom happened in Kyiv in 1905. Then Shalom Aleichem left Kyiv, though he loved this city with all of his heart. Jews were not allowed to live there. It was possible for First Guild merchants only, who made huge financial contributions into the city development.
It was Shalom Aleichem who gave Kyiv its conventional name Yehupetz, meaning small Egypt. The hardships of Kyiv Jews weren't limited to pogroms only.
For 2 years and 2 months, Kyiv was under the Nazi regime. The Kyiv Jews became the first victims of the regime in Kyiv. Babyn Yar has become the Holocaust symbol in Eastern Europe. Representatives of other ethnicities were also massacred in Babyn Yar. But only Jews died there simply because they were Jews.
Igor Kulikov's relatives also died in Babyn Yar in the days of mass shootings. According to Igor, there are 2 different stories of how his family might have died.
First of all, I trust the documents. The documents say arrested on the 29th and machine-gunned in Babyn Yar. The family legend has it that they didn't get to Babyn Yar and were buried at Nizhny Val, literally around the corner. I have a letter from my grand-granddad, Mordecai Sova. He wrote it to his relatives in Russia. A few days prior, the Germans had entered the city. Based on the letter, I was able to determine the flat Mordecai lived in. Mordecai didn't speak Russian very well. He would mix up letters. It's very challenging to read. However, I understand how he felt at the time. Among other things, it reads, "I'm already packed. I'm ready to flee." But Mom refuses. He refers to his wife Shendel. You can really sense his romantic soul. He writes, "I'm the only one left in this house. No one else is here. There is no one here. I can sense his loneliness. His children left for Russia. And on one hand, all is well, but on the other, there he was, quite advanced in years. At the time he was 63, his wife was 62. He was elderly and lonely."
For the most part of his life, Igor was ignorant of these tragic events in his family.
I was already 39 when I saw the picture of Mordecai and Shendel Sova. Can you believe it? I knew practically nothing until I was 39. Later on, I learned that every Jewish family has a number of these stories in their family history. The Babyn Yar massacre is one of the calamities that befell every other family. For example, ours. I may be wrong, but it's the result of the Soviet influence that all stories, including Jewish, were intentionally played down.
Unfortunately, it was very common. Up to this point, thousands of people are digging for information, trying to find out at least something about their close ones. This is the street that Igor mentioned, the Nizhny Val Street.
Later, I found out that the Nizhny Val, like Red Square, now it's Kontraktova Square, is a place of mass burial of people, and not only Jews. The thing is that this was Soviet Union. Historians and scientists knew very well that there were burials here. The question is how massive they were. It can be a ditch with 6 people, it can be 100 people. But the fact is that there is a road over the mass grave, cars drive there, students on Kontraktova Square go to the Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and few people know what happened here during the Second World War. We cannot even imagine. If these Jews killed in Kyiv were still alive, what would the face of the capital look like now? Cultural, scientific, social, any other.
Anatoly Podolsky is the director of the Ukrainian Center for Holocaust Studies. For several decades, he has been studying the history of the Jews of Ukraine, both as a historian and as a Jew.
I didn't understand even in childhood. And my childhood was in the beginning of the 70s. I did not understand such contradictions. When the family remembered some things, when outside, in public, at school, at the institute, everything was completely different. My family is a Kyiv Jewish family. And there were people who were killed during the war, and my family spoke about them in whispers. And in the family, through my father's line, his mother, my grandmother, and his two sisters, my aunts, whom I never knew, had been killed. I will never forget. This is 1974. I was 7 years old. My father took me and we went to Babyn Yar. In 74, there was nothing in Babyn Yar then.
This unique centre was created to preserve the memory of the fate of the Jews during the Second World War in two ways: by researching this topic and by teaching it. The life of Kyiv Jews was not easy after the tragedy of the Holocaust either.
The Soviet totalitarian regime neutralized identity. It was the idea of Lenin, then Stalin, the communists, to create a new community of people, the Soviet people. And the Jews of Kyiv fell under this. But look, according to the memories of many families, they still kept the sidurs, prayer books at home. They still remembered Hebrew, Yiddish. It was difficult, because in public it was necessary to be a Soviet person. But this tradition was preserved in the houses.
And only in the late 1980s, the process of restoring the life of the Jewish community began in Kyiv. Jewish schools were opened in Kyiv, scientific and cultural institutions were created, and public organizations appeared.
Holocaust history is not only Jewish history. This is the history of the neighboring nations. This is the history of those non-Jews, Ukrainians, Russians, Poles, who risked their own lives and saved the Jews. This is the history of those who helped the Germans. This is our thesis. We must stop being afraid of our past. We have to say what it was. Then it is easier for us to understand what is happening today. This topic is like a part of the history and culture of the last century. We publish, for example, a library of memories of the Holocaust. That is, we translate books dedicated to Ukrainian context of the Holocaust, from German, Yiddish, Polish. Our idea is to write this difficult topic in the general history of the Second World War in Ukraine.
We walk the streets so often, not fully knowing their history. We pass houses that are associated with the names of very famous figures of Jewish culture or Jewish business. We do not know about this because there are not always, at least a memorial plaque, on the facades of these houses. Today, step by step, Jewish life in Kyiv is being restored. There are several Jewish congregations here. In Kyiv, you can learn Hebrew, the history of the Jewish people and Israel. Regularly and importantly, Jewish festivals and Jewish holidays are held right in the center of the city. But we need to study history in order to fully understand what city you live in and what kind of memory this city carries. Inner Tsarok, Sergei Narozhny, for the special project, The Cities.